The last kind of analysis that we're going to talk about is the jurisdictional split analysis. Jurisdictional split analysis. Now, we touched on this a little bit when we discussed circuit splits. Remember that a circuit split is where two or more circuits tackle the same issue differently. So we have the same issue, and one circuit goes this way, jurisdiction 1, and jurisdiction 2 goes another way. Now, each circuit is a different jurisdiction, so we can also call a circuit split a jurisdictional split. In fact, jurisdictional split is actually a more general term for this, because sometimes the split isn't just between circuits. It might be between the supreme courts of two different states, or even between two different countries. But it's the same concept. You have multiple courts, multiple court systems that are not bound by each other's opinions, and they happen to have different ways of handling the same type of situation. So if you're facing a particular issue that has never come up before in your jurisdiction, it's going to be hard to predict how a court in your jurisdiction is going to rule on it. So in that case, what we do is we look at how other jurisdictions have handled the same issue, and then we see if we can come up with a reasonably educated guess about what our jurisdiction is likely to do. So because the issue has never come up before in our jurisdiction, we also sometimes call this analysis an issue of first impression. An issue of first impression. It's the first time this has come up in our jurisdiction. So how does this work? Well, if the only examples of how to handle the issue come from other jurisdictions, well, the examples are not binding on our jurisdiction. They're only persuasive authorities. So what we do is we try to predict which one of the different approaches to our issue is likely to be most persuasive to the court in our jurisdiction, and the one that will actually be adopted in our jurisdiction. So the way we organize our memo for an issue of first impression, or a jurisdictional split analysis, all right, the way we do this is we explain what jurisdiction A's rule is, or jurisdiction 1, and the reasoning behind jurisdiction 1's rule. And then we give an example of how a court in jurisdiction 1 applied its rule to a certain situation and reached a particular outcome. Essentially, we mini-brief a case from jurisdiction 1, just like we do when we're IRACing with cases. So we're still IRACing. We start with the issue, but then when we get to the rule, we might have a heading for jurisdiction 1, and we do a mini-brief. We identify the rule in jurisdiction 1, and we explain the reasoning behind it. We explain by giving an example, a situation that demonstrates how jurisdiction 1 applied that rule. We mini-brief a case from jurisdiction 1. This is just like what we did when we were IRACing with cases. And then we do the same thing for an example from jurisdiction 2. Right? We give the rule, and then we give an example of how that rule was applied to a case from that jurisdiction, and we explain the reasoning behind the rule, and we give an example of how that happened. And then comes the important part. We then discuss, this is where we get into our analysis, we then discuss which of the two jurisdictions' rules we think that our jurisdiction will adopt, and why. So, which will our jurisdiction adopt? And we explain why. Right? Maybe we're dealing with 5 jurisdictions, not just 2, and all but one of them use the same rule. So we think that our jurisdiction will adopt the majority rule. Right? Maybe it'll adopt the majority rule. It's just the direction that most other jurisdictions have gone in, so maybe our jurisdiction will do the same thing. Or maybe one of the jurisdiction's rules is more recent. So even if it's in the minority, even if it's the minority rule, Maybe we think that our jurisdiction will adopt the more recent rule because it's the more modern rule. Or we may feel that our jurisdiction has a very liberal tradition and the history behind the reasoning of Jurisdiction Two's rule is more consistent with our jurisdiction's history. So there could be a number of reasons why you think that our jurisdiction will handle an issue of first impression one way or another. Really, you're just speculating. But fortunately, the important thing is not what your prediction is. Your prediction is then going to be applied to our facts. And you reach a conclusion. But the conclusion is not the important thing. The important thing here is that you clearly lay out each of the different possibilities. That way, your reader is able to understand the whole story. Right? She knows what the different possibilities are and the various reasons for why a court in our jurisdiction might choose one possibility over another possibility. And then you'll do a regular analysis applying the rule that you've said is the one that you think will be adopted. And you apply it and then you give a conclusion. All right. Now, even though you're kind of speculating, you're just making an educated guess on this, it's still very helpful for the reader. Because now if your reader wants to argue in favor of adopting the rule from Jurisdiction 1, over the rule from Jurisdiction 2, then your reader will be prepared to raise all of the good reasons that Jurisdiction 1 had for creating its rule in the first place. And she knows the reasoning behind the rule from Jurisdiction 2, so she can prepare some arguments about why that reasoning doesn't really make sense for our jurisdiction, and so our court should not adopt Jurisdiction 2's rule.